can't be a single just transition, but rather a number of different forms the just transition can take depending on local energy history and development circumstances. What I'll do in this very brief introduction is to set the stage for the four panelists to relate their own experiences in working toward a just transition in their countries. One common point is clear. The Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement have really clarified the roadmap to 2030 and to 2050 for transforming energy systems globally. And we don't have to look too far to understand why that transformation is important. Examples abound. Most importantly, however, is that we're already seeing the impacts of climate change ever more clearly in the form of increasingly intense tropical cyclones, droughts, wildfires, heavy precipitation events, and more. The Earth system is flashing a bright red light at us to stop business as usual and to change course now. Therefore, we must work toward both mitigating the worst impacts of climate change in the future, while at the same time building up adaptive capacity to the changes that we're already seeing. Currently, we still rely on fossil fuels for 85% of our energy needs. The Paris Agreement 1.5C goal implies that CO2 emissions must be reduced toward zero by about mid-century. That dependence on non-renewable fossil energy has been convenient, but is now leading toward global climate chaos and is not what's needed in the more resilient, flexible, and sustainable energy systems of the future. The 2050 date, however, is deceptive. What once sounded like a long time in the future is increasingly becoming not so long-term. Rather, we must start in earnest now because achieving targets for 2050 means being well on our way by 2030, only 8 years or so from now. And we know it takes time to rebuild and, in many cases around the globe, to build up modern energy infrastructure. The International Energy Agency has already said that achieving 1.5 degrees C means avoiding new fossil fuel exploration projects. But every bit of new fossil fuel infrastructure installed today, from power plants to home heating systems, will be active to about mid-century. That's one reason why China's announcement yesterday that they will halt financing of coal plants in other countries could be a very big deal. But even parts of the broader energy system that we usually think of as shorter lived, like cars and other personal vehicles, live longer than we usually think, often 15, 20 years or more for new models, and sometimes even longer when we consider the exports from wealthy countries to developing countries. The implication of these lifetimes is that even for cars, trying to get to emissions-free transportation by 2050 roughly means selling no more new gasoline engine cars by the early 2030s. Not very far in the future. However, the remarkable good news is that we've developed over the past few decades renewable energy and other technologies to the point that these can often compete economically, even on the tilted playing field distorted by ongoing subsidies to fossil fuels. In a country like Ambassador Black Lane's Antigua and Barbuda, installing solar panels immediately saves more money than the cost of fuel oil used for current power generation. The savings with respect to retail electricity costs are even greater. Antigua is not alone in this situation. Solar and wind energy should nowadays never be referred to as alternative energy. They are the sources of energy of today and the future. Increasingly around the world, planned coal-fired power plants are being canceled. By some accounts, 75% have been withdrawn since the signing of the Paris Agreement. That's really the easy part of the transformation challenge. Although for a country like South Africa, as I'm sure we'll hear, how to transition workers into a new energy economy is still a real challenge. Similar challenges will exist in Mexico as well, with its all-important oil industry, and Argentina had been toying with a move into fracking for natural gas. But it's not only larger producers who face headwinds. Countries like Guyana and Cote d'Ivoire are making fossil resource discoveries and hoping even now that these will be a key to future economic development. Unfortunately, wealthier countries are often not setting a good example, with few notable exceptions. A decade or so ago, I was surprised at the desperate lengths to which the energy sector in the United States went to ramp up fracking of natural gas in spite of the negative impacts. And who would have thought that financial institutions would continue pumping billions into an industry that has still not been in the black as a whole? That money, had it been invested in renewable energy, would have done wonders toward moving the energy transformation forward. And in Germany, the coal industry lobby is strong enough to persuade the government to spend tens of billions of dollars to phase out to bail out failing power plants and protect 20,000 jobs, while at the same time, they stand by and watch as 100,000 jobs in the solar industry disappear. There are entrenched interests that are important to consider. All these examples demonstrate the need to carefully consider local circumstances when thinking through a just transition. It's not just about jobs, of course, but also about creating energy systems that are resilient, that closely serve the needs of citizens, and that can contribute to a more democratic, person-centered energy system, rather than a system of centralized extraction of energy to be wastefully burned and that leaves that waste for future generations to deal with. The challenge that the panelists today are taking up in their work, and about which they will be speaking and exchanging ideas, is to shape that new energy future, learning lessons from the past, but always looking forward. And now let's hear from these experts.
All right. Thank you, Bob. Sorry, I was still muted. So thanks for this very in-depth and very interesting round trip around all the different important topics around just transitions. You mentioned Germany failing out companies. Yeah, I think that was kind of a telltale thing, because I would agree, hailing from Germany, where we have been dealing with just transitions for quite some time in black coal and now in brown coal. And the most important thing that Germans seem to be good at is throwing money at the problem. I am not convinced that that is the only or even the best solution, and that is why I'm very, very happy that we have a number of different countries who tackle this problem with maybe less money, but more enthusiasm and more innovative solutions. And I would like to start with Ambassador Blacklane. Your Excellency, good to have you here. And as a very small country, or as a representative of a very small country, you are maybe less concerned with like the huge energy transitions that countries like South Africa will face, but I'm sure there are more innovative solutions that you may talk about. So please go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much, and thank you for the opportunity to speak. And it's good to see Bob, and I work with climate analytics here. You can hear me well? Yes, okay. So we work with climate analytics here in Antigua and Barbuda on two main issues, well, our NDCs, and as we were developing our NDCs, a lot of issues and doing our consultations, we begin to realize that we have to consider an important issue of the transitional risk. So we are forced to transition. We don't want to transition, really. Everything is, if it wasn't for the climate change, the inconvenient truth, I guess, of that, we wouldn't have to transition. And so as we were working through our NDCs, we started to see a picture emerging that for my small island is a lot less complicated than South Africa, for example. But still, it is still a challenge for us here. So let's see the areas that we want to transition and what are some of the transitional risks that we anticipate. So of course, we have to transition. We are transitioning our energy sector. We are transitioning our transportation sector. And important to that is our taxation systems. A lot of taxes come from those sectors. So we will be doing a study for those and transition that sector as well. And then we have to look at our agenda lens of how we manage that transition, and some of the transitional risks that we are looking at, that we're going to be focusing on in terms of preparing ourselves for, is actually one of the biggest risks is political risk. And so we're going to be working on that. So at the end of all of this, the hope that we would have is that we would have a much more diverse energy system that is more market-based and is driven by the market more than driven by subsidies or have access to one type of technology. And that's basically where we are in Antigua and Barbuda and in many countries. So if you want to buy energy, you only have an option to purchase fossil fuel energy in many cases. And that is not weird to us because that is how it's always been for our parents and our grandparents. So we're now beginning to understand that there is in fact a market where you can have a combination of energy options. So we just, I love the word you use, energy system, and I see one of the panelists is energy system specialist. But for us, we refer to the energy system like an ecosystem for Antigua and Barbuda to include fossil fuel at the end of the day. We still include some fossil fuel, renewable energy, wind, solar, and with batteries, of course. And so that is what we see in the future. And we worked with Robert and his team at the Climate Analytics to try and get an idea of financially what that would mean for us and what that would mean for everyone. And as we were going through all of that, I drove past one of our car dealerships and I looked at the layout of the car dealership, and half of the place that they occupy, the business occupied, is for after-sales service and for selling parts and so on. And you go there, all of us go all the time to the car dealer and that section. With the transition to electric vehicle, that whole section will disappear. So our car dealers, their whole business model for which is included after sales service, for example, would disappear. That was something I learned, which was new. In the energy sector, we will still have a utility, but utility here in Antigua does not want to. So the car dealers don't want to transition because literally their business model is upended. The utility does not want to transition. They don't want to, they spend 10 years being an engineer, now you have to transition. The mechanics who deal with cars are happy to transition. And the government taxation system is happy to transition. So we have this combination of persons and people that we have to look for and transition. And this is just at the national level. There are transitions that we have to take at the regional level and at the international level. If we continue to engage, like for climate finance, for example, the people at the World Bank and the GCF and so on, they too have to transition because the way that they monitor and track and disperse climate finance and provide access to climate finance has to change. And that too has to transition. So we accept that. And we're looking at that, and we believe that we have to know the exact nature of the transition, who we have to transition, or else we will face we're facing resistance now, and we'll have to face a lot of resistance. Now, how do you manage that transition? So for us here, for me personally, I'm a very direct person, as some of you would know. And my style is to just tell people, this is what the transition is going to look like, and this is how it's going to affect you. I do not believe in misinformation or trying to soften the blow or anything like that. And that is could be a direct clash with our political directorate, who understand it has to be a transition, but not really quite ready to talk about it. Sorry. But sorry. But for them, they're a huge political race. And so there's a lot of getting the idea, okay, we've made up our mind what we're going to do. We have an NDC that we've published. It's really ambitious. We will be transitioning. We have transition targets in our NDC, but the political risk is really great. And we have no handle on that. So we're seeing in the United States now that the Congress called upon all of the oil companies, for example, to come to Congress, just report on how they fund misinformation, because this is what they do, and they will fund your opposition. So in Antigua, that too is a problem here because we have a very strong monopoly, a private monopoly that's providing electricity, and they're not going to go away easily. And they're going to fight to maintain this monopoly. And we have to understand what we're transitioning away from as well. We're not transitioning away just from the energy system of just fossil fuel. Remember, they have policies in every country. They have a financial system that literally together combined give them a monopoly and power. And these persons are more powerful than prime ministers and even presidents. So when we show up to our meeting at COP in our economy seat, barely in the back of the plane, they're showing up with their private jets, right? And they're able to negotiate for themselves over $600 billion a year with our fossil fuel subsidies. And we can't even negotiate at COP $2.4 billion a year to fix the problem that they're creating. So they're a really powerful group, and we cannot underestimate that. And that, because of that, many politicians do not want to announce their NDCs. So many, like China, is doing massive work of transitioning. They're just not talking about it. So we're seeing a lot of government doing transition, Australia included, but they're just not talking about it. And we discussed it, and we discussed it with our politicians, and there's a lot of risk that comes with talking about it. However, when we get climate finance from the financial mechanism of the convention, they insist that you talk about it. You go out and do consultations, and you get information, you bring it back and send it to them. So we have that little bit of a difficulty that we need to work through. And so we acknowledge in our NDC that transitional risk is a problem. We acknowledge that the just transition of the workforce is something that we really want to do. And one of the outcomes is not only to transition everyone, but there are huge amount of benefits at the end of the day, which I haven't mentioned before, for new entrepreneurs, for new businesses, for diversification of who owns the generation system for energy. In Antigua, our energy system has to be resilient because of hurricanes. So many people are buying solar panels for their house and with battery systems. And we are at the DOE creating projects to help them fund that. And so we're developing a whole new sector for your own energy system at your house. And so there's a lot of opportunity for that. And we do not want that to be lost in the transition. And I know that for many of us, we're talking about bankable projects, and we have the export credit banks of the different developed countries funding renewable energy transition, but the ownership of the generation just leave from a national monopoly to an external finance monopoly. So we want those benefits and the opportunity to invest to stay here. So this is our vision for our just transition, and that is what we're going to fight for. Thank you.
Ambassador Blacklane, that is quite a large agenda that you are facing there, and I hope that this works out, because that would be extremely helpful. You mentioned opportunities for entrepreneurs. I think that is very crucial to have that, and that's also a very good transition to Mauro from FARN, who I would like to have speak before Anna in this case, because I think it just works really well to look at this from a more individual point of view. So Mauro, if you want to, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Florian. Do you hear me okay? Yes, okay, so thank you very much. It's a pleasure to share this panel with you, with Ambassador Blacklane, with Anna, and with Jesse. Let me share my screen very briefly. There you go. You see it okay? Yes, right? Okay. So very fast on this. First of all, I'm Mauro Fernandez. I'm a freelance researcher working with Fundación Ambiente y Recursos Naturales, FARN. And what I'm going to present now is the advance of a study that we've been doing for a specific case study in Rio Turbio. It's a coal mining town in the south of the southern province of one of the southern countries of the world, Argentina, which is a single asset town for quite some time. So I will introduce that case study particularly to understand the difficulties and the complexities of just transitions in contexts like that. But first of all, let me, if this allows me, go to a brief national context to know where we are at. Argentina is a upper middle income country. It's part of the G20. It's part of the climate transparency reports every year to understand our performance on that. on climate issues and our performance on NDCs and how are we transforming our energy matrix. So while we are an upper middle income country, 6 out of 10 children are poor in Argentina, as well as 42% of all Argentinians. These are numbers from last year. Even now, this is even worse because of the pandemic and the economic impact that it had in our territories. Our economy is based in exports of raw materials, while the external debt is already about 100% of our GDP. So this is contextualization to understand why these two following points, like extractivism and debt, are a colonial vicious circle that are putting more pressure on the common goods of Argentina as well as other countries, but particularly in Argentina. But at the same time, the solution that sometimes appears, this industrialization is still linked to models that are linked to the 20th century, like industrializing fossil industries and yeah, already obsolete models of industrialization that we need to transition from. In that scenario, fossil fuels represent almost 90% of the energy grid, the primary energy grid, but the share goes down to 68% in electricity generation, while in 2020, coal was only 1% of that electricity generation, with one coal power plant in San Nicolas that is burning imported coal from South Africa. And here is why the question appears. What happens with the Rio Turbio coal mine? Why are we talking about this? And this is why this is particularly an interesting case study to try to understand why having a town that is dependent and living and building its identity from coal extraction is not even selling the coal that it's produced to the other coal power plant that is in Argentina. And this is because the South African coal is cheaper and the conditions in Rio Turbio are not good and it's not producing enough. This is why, after a long struggle from the miners as well, governmental plans are to open a 240 megawatts coal power plant next to the Rio Turbio coal mine, aiming to make that coal extraction profitable. And here is why, where we get to the case study particularly. Again, Rio Turbio, a villa minera, single asset coal town founded in 1942. It has 16,000 inhabitants right now, which more than 2,000 work in the company, Yacimientos Carboníferos Rio Turbio, but the rest of the town is dependent on the activity of that mine that again is not profitable. It's now dependent on subsidies from the state for quite some years. Again, when I went there, when I talked to the miners, when I talked to people selling food close by, not just people working in the company, I found out that this identity was like an assumption that we had before with the team from FARN, but this identity of the town was built around the figure of a brave state miner, because Yacimientos Carboníferos Rio Turbio is a partly state-owned company, and it's again dependent on state subsidies, and that's something that they have conquered, which is why we see struggles to survive from the workers, from the miners that resisted the neoliberal attempts during the 90s and the structural adjustment programs in the 90s to privatize and to close that mine. They struggle, they keep it open. Part of that. So one of their key ways out of the state where they were, that was close to closing, was to build a new coal power plant to channel that production that otherwise it's meaningless. So we have a state here that is fueling that, while, let me say, Argentina is committed to net zero by 2050, has a stabilized NDC by 2030, has targets of increasing renewable power. Nevertheless, they are also saying next year we're going to open a 240 new coal power plant to channel this production. And there are challenges in the town, as we will see. This is why the research objectives were to identify the local relationship of those, not the 16,000 inhabitants, but key workers and people living there, face-to-face conversations and very open and honest conversations. What I want to thank the Rio Turbio people for having them with me, to identify local relationships with the concept of just transition and to identify potential outlines for alternative development pathways for the area. And what we have seen as a key finding, and I will try to close this first intervention with this part, and then we move to another section. Is first, this rooted identification with that figure of the miner. The legacy is not even close to be disputed. It needs to be resignified. And this is, again, conversations coming from them, from unions, from workers, male workers, female workers, and different outlines that we will see here. But the legacy of the miner is not something to be disputed. It needs to be swiftly resignified. This call of or death, big title appeared many times. It's like an overwhelming narrative to imagine alternative economies for living in Rio Turbio. They do not see that there is a potential way out, for example, with touristic promotion or with agricultural businesses. They identify themselves as miners, as coal miners, and they believe that that's their source of identity. At the same time, it appears feminism that in Argentina is very strong, and that feminism is shaking these fossil masculinities that we could explore, and I know that Ambassador Blacklane has explored deeply, and I agree, and I've seen there that is this male-dominated industry that kind of resists to die what happens sometimes, not from the workers themselves, but from the leadership of the company. But that feminism that shakes these masculinities is providing a platform to, again, resignify the concept of transitioning, moving it away from the threat that it's supposed sometimes into a learning path. That is already happening. Well, there are many cases, but there's one particular case in Rio Turbio where you can see that particularly happening. There's also rising small-scale alternative production, like, for example, youth with craft beer. It's something new that it appeared right now. And of course, it's small scale. It's not that the 16,000 people are going to live out of that. But those cases, you can see how their families were resisted, for example, were resisting their incursion into new alternative models, because they believe that these kids and this youth should be miners, and that was their destiny. And they challenged that with a lot of strength and with a lot of tenacity and patience. They managed to open new small-scale alternative production model. And then one key issue I think could be common, and I think that's going to be very rich for this conversation, is that workers are very aware of the common but differentiated responsibilities, and that the coal mine in the south of the southern province in one of the southern countries of the world is not the problem of climate change. It was not responsible for that. They say this very firmly. And at the same time, they acknowledge that there are 2050 targets, but they see that as an opportunity to talk about moving the conversation of transitioning 30 or further 30 years, and to start talking about that in 2050 and not right now, because now it's the global north that needs to start transitioning, not the southern workers that need to be suffering. And here is why I noticed that these approaches that are uncaring, that do not consider these complexities, are going to produce a lot of resistance. Resistance is expected if uncaring approaches from the state and from organizations working on these kind of transitions are not taken. So very complex, I think, in this first intervention. I will stop here to let others talk, and then we can go into specific challenges and opportunities to move forward. Thank you very much, Florian.
Thank you, Mauro, for sharing this extremely interesting case study on a just transition, especially considering that for Argentina, at least coal is not the largest issue here. Moving on then to a country where fossil fuels and transitioning from fossil fuels is actually a much larger issue, and there is a lot of stuff moving and happening in Mexico, and Ana is in the middle of it, so maybe she can tell us a little bit about that.
Hi, thank you very much, Florian. Can you hear me? Can you hear me well? Perfect. I'm going to be sharing my screen. Okay, 1 second. Okay, there are a million options for sharing my screen. Okay. I'm sorry, it's giving me the option of sharing basically all of my windows, and I have so many windows open and it's not telling me which one is which. So
I see your pain.
yeah, it just says Microsoft PowerPoint, and since I have several different presentations open, I don't want to click on the wrong one.
Show us what you're working on.
Yes, well, hopefully this one is the correct one. Not loading. Again. Okay, it's not working. I don't want to take a lot of time, so I might as well just start talking without it. Okay, or maybe, yeah, I see Jesse is offering to go ahead. Yes, Jesse, I'm gonna figure out what's wrong with my sharing of the screen. Is
Please
that
go
okay,
ahead,
Florian?
Jesse.
For just,
Sure,
yes,
sure.
I'm sorry, I'll check it.
Jesse is
problem.
ready to take over.
Thanks, guys. So as mentioned, I'm going to talk about South Africa briefly, actually less briefly than everyone else, because I'm going to do two sections in one. And I want to just start with a little bit of context. I don't want to spend too much time on the South African context because I think people might be more familiar with it. But just to mention that the way we kind of seeing just transition in South Africa is in two ways. One, it's very much built around how do you protect workers and communities in a big coal phase out. South Africa's real challenges around coal, but it is also going to be economy wide. And in developing countries especially, it's really important that we do think about just transition as an economy wide transition. It's about changing your energy system. It's about changing your transport systems, food systems. You know, it's bigger than always just coal. In the South African case, I think coal is the first one. So I'm going to talk a lot about that right now, but there's a lot of work kind of emerging now and starting to think also about this in the context of refineries, in the liquid fuels value chain, steel, et cetera, et cetera. So the South African context, we're the most unequal country in the world, huge levels of poverty. COVID has worsened these socioeconomics considerably. So 8% GDP loss last year. Debt servicing costs have reached 22% of government revenue, so extremely fiscally constrained in terms of what the government themselves can do. Based on the Bloomberg assessment, we've got the highest levels of unemployment in the world now. So 44% of adults in South Africa do not work. This translates into pre-COVID, more than half of the country living in poverty and 25% living in extreme poverty. And at the moment, we still see it between 30 and 40% of households are running out of money to buy food every month. You know, you're seeing less in children because adults are going hungry to feed kids. So in this context, every single job is really, really important. In Mpumalanga is the main coal mining region. It's about where 80% of the coal comes from. Some of these development challenges are of course exacerbated by a long history of extraction. You know, unemployment's even higher, it's almost 47% in general, but youth unemployment, and especially youth unemployment for women, is almost 70%. You've got mining affected communities who've been impacted for many years by blasting and dust and acid mine drainage and bad mine closure processes in terms of both social aspects and environmental aspects. The air and water pollution and the degraded land is important, you know, not also from just an environmental perspective, but also because what it translates into is limitations on alternative livelihoods or opportunities. So there's a lot of thinking now, how can you use this mine closures? What can we grow in degraded mining land? What are the kind of product and value chains that might emerge out of that? There's extreme competition for land and water from coal, lots of informal coal use. So if you can see my picture here, you know, women and children who are picking coal to use in households because they lack access to modern energy services. And almost half of the population is living below the lower bound poverty line. You know, it's $54 a month. Just transition in this context, really, there's two challenges in the region. One, the GDP of some of the towns is incredibly dependent on coal. So the province as a whole, it gets roughly a fifth. I mean, this is similar to sort of provinces in Indonesia as well. And some of these towns, you know, like a Malahleni, which means place of coal, 44% of that 44% of that GDP of that town comes from coal, you know, and on top of that, you've also got electricity, you know, lots of coal plants. Basically, our whole coal sector is in a 100-kilometer radius, or the majority of it. And in a town like a Malahleni, you know, 26% of employment, so 1 in 4 workers is working in the coal sector. We've done some work to look at kind of what happens, you know, as you start phasing coal out, and there's 2 main challenges. So one, even in a business as usual, so not a hugely ambitious kind of Paris-aligned pathway, because of the economics of alternatives, you start to see a reduction in coal into the future. And what that really first starts to impact is new entrants. So there's a lot of churn in the sector. You have a lot of miners who are leaving before retirement age. We think mostly because they're too sick to work, but it's very under-researched. And you have a lot of younger workers coming in all the time. And so as you start to see a reduction in or no growth in the coal sector, there's no job creation for those young workers who would be entering. So that's the first challenge. On top of that, as you start to phase coal out more quickly, you know, if you're looking at like a 2040 coal phase out, something that's aligned with Paris and is achievable in the South African context, that has also the impact of meaning that you get forced job losses. And this is not insignificant. Each miner supports at least 4 dependents. And there's a whole lot of interconnections in these towns, of course, as I've mentioned. So if you go from a kind of business as usual scenario into a 2040 coal power phase out, you end up growing those forced job losses from less than 3,000 to about 25,000 over the next 19 years. I've mentioned, you know, you're missing in these kinds of analyses sometimes all the extra impact of no new hires. And the thing to note about this is that a lot of these workers will already struggle to find new employment in other sectors, either because of their age, they're getting old, their educational attainment, their health, and simply because in South Africa there are no other jobs. If there's 47% unemployment, that's because there's nowhere else for people to work. So it's really important as we're thinking about just transition to think about it as economic diversification. You know, that's important for small businesses, for youth, for workers who are leaving young. So you also need to think about labor market policies for all the workforce, and of course social protection and service delivery, because there's issues with water, there's issues with housing, etc. in these regions, and this must all be underpinned by social dialogue. So what's actually going on in South Africa at the moment? And this is the part that really excites me, actually. There's so much happening at the moment. I wanted to make a list here of all the research projects and processes, and it didn't even fit on 3 slides. There's so much happening. People have really woken up. The fact that Eskom has actually started to close some coal plants, they've reached the end of their lives, it's not for climate reasons, has really provided a lot of impetus around thinking how this can look. A lot of work is being done to think about this at a national level, and then how you could apply that to particular sectors. So civil society are running processes with communities and workers. Organized labor, COSATU are doing their own internal process on how they see a just transition, building on their earlier work on this, because in fact this was driven by workers initially. Our Presidential Climate Commission is developing a national just transition framework. Their national government departments, provincial governments and municipalities in the region who are developing strategies or going through processes to talk about just transition. Eskom, our monopoly utility, have got a just energy transition office. Organized business have a net zero just transition process where they're doing analysis and looking at kind of sectoral interventions. There's the emergence of new institutions that are looking at green economy development in the region, and there's post-mining economy. There's an entity looking at post-mining economies, especially land and water use. So there's a lot happening. One of the questions is, how much will this cost? So Meridian Economics have proposed what they're calling a just transition transaction climate finance deal, which is designed around also helping kind of accelerate decarbonization in a way that will also help us to support some of our challenges around our monopoly utility Eskom, because Eskom is in a financial crisis. But as part of that, what they've also done is said, you know, can we use the creation of this transaction, which will be essentially a refinancing deal for South Africa, to also capitalize a just transition fund. And we can use that just transition fund for a whole lot of things, to build a coordinating body, for example, to look at establishing kind of industrial development initiatives in the region, like a special economic zone, looking at infrastructure development in some of the municipalities, costing various interventions for workers, so retraining, relocation, some payout, not always early retirement, you know, that kind of thing. And they've calculated, they think it'll cost about $1 billion US. So that gives you a sense of the kind of scale of the challenge in the South African context, specifically around some of the just transition interventions. At the same time, one of the organizations who was working on this kind of looking at the framework for just transition nationally are thinking a lot about what are the kinds of, how do we think about justice in this context? So, you know, obviously there's procedural justice involving everyone in decision making, then there's distributive justice, so who pays the costs, who benefits, and then also restorative justice. So how do we undo a lot of the impacts of the past? From an apartheid, you know, we live in a post-apartheid state, many years of colonialism, but also the kinds of impacts that I described around Mpumalanga. And they're looking at kind of a spectrum of ambition. So can we think about kind of the less just transition ambition and the more just transition ambition type ideas? And these range, I'm not going to read them all to you, but you can look at these slides, you know, looking at sustainable and resilient housing in affected regions, all the way over to saying, do we need a basic income grant? Is this really how we deal with, is this how we create a just society? You know, is this one of the interventions we can look at? So these are great. You should go and look at this paper by Guillaume Saint-Clair, because it's almost like a menu that you can start to think, what would work in our context? Maybe not this, maybe this with a tweak, you know, what is plausible in our social and political contexts. TIPS, that organization, are also doing some really interesting work on just transition finance roadmaps. And what they're doing is they've been assessing like real proposed projects and thinking about how do we think about what is just transition ambition, you know, so how do we say, what are the social indicators that make it more or less just? And they've been looking at the size of investment needs for projects in the region, the kind of risk profiles that they have, what the benefits they might bring could be, and thinking about the interconnectedness. So maybe one part of this value chain could come from a kind of normal financial intervention, but it hasn't necessarily got huge just transition benefits, but it unlocks a whole lot of potential benefits downstream. Can the finance sector or ecosystem respond to some of these needs? Yes or no? You know, how do we match supply and demand and finance for these kinds of projects? Or do you need to package them together so that, you know, intervention 1, which leads to intervention 3, 4, 5, and 6 downstream with loads with much more kind of just transition ambition, you know, how do you make that happen? And then finally, I just wanted to briefly mention Eskom. So Eskom's Just Energy Transition Office. Eskom, I mean, South Africa gets 96% of our electricity from coal. We're the most coal-dependent country in the G20. But their goal is now net zero emissions by 2050 with an increase in sustainable jobs. They're looking at repowering and repurposing options at some of these plants that are being closed. There's been some discussion around what they're calling the JET transaction or financing facility, which is a discussion around, you know, can South Africa agree to decarbonize more quickly than our baseline in exchange for this refinancing deal? And they're undertaking social impact studies to look at the closure across all of the plants, you know, the whole fleet in the region. What is the skills framework you need? In the energy sector, what can they pursue? You know, accelerated renewables, mini grid manufacturing. What can a really old power station like Komati, which is the one that's being repowered and repurposed first, you know, what can we do there? Can we create hubs of some sort? And so there's a lot of exciting stuff happening in South Africa. It's not all easy. There are, of course, huge challenges and political debates around achieving just transition. There's not a clear consensus on the pathway. So parts of government are still contemplating new coal. For me, it's a big question, you know, a transition for who and in what sectors? How do we make sure these are really inclusive processes and there's ownership by communities and workers? How do we prioritize them? You know, how do we put people at the center of this? Ownership, as was mentioned earlier, is really important here. You know, there's been a fight for many years around public versus private power. And so obviously in the energy sector, this is key, but it's also beyond that. You know, what about household energy strategies? What about household energy poverty, which is not being addressed? We're constrained by debt and our lack of fiscal space. There's a sense, you know, that, you know, as Mauro was saying, we're not really responsible for this. This is climate change is being caused by, historical cumulative emissions, and that is not primarily the developing world. And with unmet climate finance promises, how can we trust that this will happen? But I think, I see sort of an emerging consensus that and action around funding, at least for understanding the just transition challenge, if not yet at the scale like kind of needed to really shift South Africa into having a just transition. And for me, there's a real question around coordination and the details of planning, because this happens in the power sector. It includes mining. Is it a regional problem? How do we bring in industrial policy? How does the province look at their economic development, as well as very specific challenges for municipalities? Thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Jessie. That is extremely interesting what you're talking about there, and I think South Africa is actually one of the countries that is actually farthest in this whole transition phase. And I was completely blown away hearing you about talking about Eskom's position on this, because this is really something new. Anna, do you have similar things in Mexico that you can talk about? Is the Mexican fossil industry as conducive to just transition as it is in South Africa?
Thank you, Florian. Very, very good questions. And I just want to apologize again for not being able to share the screen. It turned out to be a problem with the recording, that I had to give a permission for recording. Anyway, here we are. And I'm realizing, hearing the other panelists, and of course it's an honor to be here, and thank you for the invitation, that in Mexico we are having to sort of like take a step back in the narrative and in the whole process of explaining a just transition, just because we are having to again argue that we need an energy transition. So you're going to see this reflected in my presentation. We are having the need of, again, having to explain that we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And I'm going to get a little bit more into detail in a few minutes. Sorry, I forgot to start my timer, but you can tell me if I'm going over time, okay? Florian, feel free to interrupt. Anyway, first of all, I think we have to start by recognizing that there's not enough energy to sustain our current consumption and economic growth, a little bit of what Mauro was already addressing. Beyond an energy transition, what we require is a paradigm shift. And then we are in the process of asking ourselves what type of energy transition we want, and again, arguing for that energy transition. And I want to point out in this slide, of course, you can see the huge spike of everything that we need. We need like a ton of new capacity, electric cars. We have to reduce oil supplies, but I also want to point out the critical minerals demand and how much that is going to increase, because that is a lot of the criticism that we get in Mexico, saying like we are pushing for renewables, but where are these panels going to come from? How are these windmills are going to be built and things like that? And actually, Mexico is a lithium-rich country, relatively. And the president today submitted a proposal for what we're calling a lithium law. He submitted it just today. We haven't had time to study it in detail, but it is the demand for critical minerals. It is something that is going to start playing more and more into the conversation of a just transition in Mexico. I wanted to use our climate transparency country profile because I think it's a great way of portraying how much we need this just transition. And again, in Mexico, we're having to make this argument again that we need to transition to renewable energies. Energy is about 70% of Mexico's emission. Our Ndc target is far from the 1.5 degrees fair range. We need to reduce our emissions by a lot more than our NDC, and actually our 2020 NDC update was moved our target even less ambitious than we had before. So we're going backwards instead of going forward. Here you see the gap, and this is before the NDC update. It's now even further. Again, remind all of us that Mexico has an 89% fossil fuel in the energy mix. So it's huge. And then also we have there we go. We have 60% of natural gas and then 11% of oil. And out of our 17% of renewables, a big chunk of it is hydropower. And then the wind onshore is our other big chunk, but it has caused a little bit of local social resistance. And that is what originally made ICM start looking at what we could do for the energy transition to be more socially inclusive. And I'm going to address all of that in the second part of my presentation. Again, to state the argument of how much we need to work for this transition, Mexico has to reduce in 55% our emissions to be in the 1.5 pathway. Sorry. And here is how the different technologies and different fuels would have to be reduced for us to be in the 1.5 pathway. So we would have to largely increase solar and wind, and completely get rid of coal, diesel, and fuel oil, which is obvious for our types of conversation, but it's not obvious for the public in Mexico right now. So it is important for me to stress this. There's no space for diesel, coal, or fuel oil if we want to stay in a 1.5, or if we want to even achieve our NDC, which is not even that ambitious. Okay, so now I want to talk about the political scenario in Mexico, because this is our main challenge right now. In 2015, we had our energy transition law, which marks a 35% of renewable energy by 2024. But then we had auctions that ensured the cheapest energy supplies in the mix, which of course allowed for wind and solar as cheap technologies to start entering the energy mix. But then with a change in government in 2018, auctions were canceled, and very few renewable energy projects have been installed since then. There's a new refinery being built, and it's one of the president's top priorities. The president has also talked about another coal power plant, and has talked about buying more coal from local miners. So the whole energy discourse in Mexico, which is being focused on energy sovereignty, is based on fossil fuels. And renewable energies have been portrayed as sort of like evil private company entities that we have to protect ourselves from. So that's why we are having to give this whole argument again. As I had mentioned, the Ndc is lowering climate ambition. And then also there was a bill from the president to reform the electricity legal framework to, instead of having the cheapest energy go first, now we're having, the proposal is to have the state-owned energies go first. So this means more fossil and less renewable. And of course, that reduces the incentives for more renewable energy in Mexico. Furthermore, what happened this year is that trying to help our national oil company deal with their high sulfur fuel oil, a lot of the power plants that were using natural gas have shifted to start using fuel oil. So this is of course crazy, because it's a lot more pollutant and it emits a lot more gases. So again, we're going backwards just to conserve our national companies. In addition to this complex national political scenario, we have a very complex local scenarios in Mexico. We have a very complex communal land ownership schemes in Mexico. And it's not surprising that in 5% of the current global cases of socio-environmental conflicts are currently based in Mexico. This is not only energy, but a lot of different other projects, mostly related to large infrastructure. In this context, we do have a legal framework for participation and social inclusion in project development, so in energy project development. We have these different instruments, and in the recent years, we have studied these instruments in detail, and we have identified also a lot of challenges within each of these instruments, mostly that they are not really participatory. And we have found that if we do want to have these renewable energy projects be successful and be actually just, we have to increase the degree of participation and make participation actually significant within the instruments that the government already uses. This is a little bit of what we found. We implemented a large 3-year project around a renewable energy deployment in Mexico and how renewable energy could be more inclusive. And what we found is all of these points, which I'm not going to read each and every one of them, but we do need to make modifications in Mexico from the understanding of the climate crisis and who it is affecting, and framing it not as an environmental crisis, but as a human rights crisis, and as a crisis that will impact those that are the least responsible for those climate changes. And then also we have to go into very detail into the instruments that we already have. And a lot of what Jesse and Mauro had been discussing around carbon, we also have those challenges because we still have 3 coal power plants. So in short, the challenge in Mexico is enormous, from the most basic understanding of climate change to the most specific and complex way of how to transition a coal mining community into a different source of income. So yeah, not a very positive scenario, but we do have some ideas, and we're gonna talk about those in the next portion. Sorry if I
Yeah, thank you, Anna. And since you, due to the shifts, are the last speaker, you can actually go ahead and do the second portion directly if you want to. Just to interpose one question here, Rodrigo Navas asks if there is a chance that Mexico could shift energy policies towards a 1.5-degree pathway in the midterm. And I think that is actually a good leading question for you to provide some answers and suggestions in the second part.
Sure. So he's asking if it's feasible to go to shift.
Yeah, if there is actually a chance.
I want to say yes, but but not really. To be honest, it's very complicated, at least in the short term. It is feasible. ICM has conducted studies on what we would need to actually be on our 1.5 fair share pathway within the different sectors. And it is something that can happen, but it would require a lot of financing, a lot of course, political will for it to happen. So we don't see it feasible in terms of financing and politics right now, but it is technically feasible. So yeah, that's the answer. And now I'm hesitating whether to share my screen or not, because since I cannot see you when I share my screen, I feel like I'm talking to myself. But so I think I'm not, but I'm gonna talk about the discussions that we're having in Mexico around the just energy transition. And it is it's a crucial moment for Mexico because of these political discussions that we've been having between the different stakeholders and the private sector being more and more portrayed as the evil, like the evil guys, and then actually like trying to envision what energy transition we want when we are not really having any transition at all. It's been particularly hard, but what we have been pushing for in ICM is to work towards having a social and human rights perspective included in the practices and capacities of the different stakeholders and in the different instruments for governance, planning, and design of the energy transition. So that is what definitely we are pushing for. And we do believe that it's possible to have different scales of projects, because that's also a debate that we have been having in Mexico. Is it our large scale projects the problem? Should we only have small scale projects, but then those are not financially feasible? So should we have more distributed generation or not? So what we're arguing is that we have to have a combination of different scales and property schemes. So it doesn't all have to be private. It doesn't all have to be large scale. We can have different scales and different forms of developing renewable energies. And it's not all the way we have been seeing and the way that it has been generating local resistance. Things can be developed different. And also we are trying to push for the opportunity for local communities to become allies, and not only the beneficiaries or the potential the potential problem or the potential beneficiaries of a project. We think that local communities can really become allies and have power in the decision making of renewable energy projects, and then be co-responsible for the development of the projects. Of course, transparency and accountability are a huge challenge in Mexico since always, and especially right now. And we do believe that those are fundamental for a just transition in Mexico. And another thing that we found that is fundamental is that we have to focus more on our prior territorial and ecological planning. So a lot of the challenges in Mexico go back to the land, the distribution of the land and the uses of the land not having been planned democratically. So there are being a lot of changes in the use of the soil without the proper consultations of the local communities, and then that is what is detonating a lot of the local resistance against projects. So we believe we have to look at how just like the land and the territory is organized. And in ICM, we have a few projects that for us are very encouraging. One is looking at coal. Again, we have in Mexico, we still have 3 coal power plants, 2 in the northern state of Coahuila, and most of the coal that is mined in Mexico for burning for electricity is used in those 2 coal power plants. And we are developing a project on how we can trace a just coal phase out pathway, working with the local communities, because a lot of what Mauro described that is happening in Argentina is also happening in Mexico in terms of the identities of the communities being developed around the mining of coal. Like these communities did not exist prior to the mines. These towns were founded because of the coal mines. So we are having to shift we're going to have to shift the entire way that people are connected to their own land, and we have to develop not only other substitutions for that generation, but also for the income and the identities of the people in the Mexican coal region. So we're working on that for one side. And also we have been working in our project Communities and Renewable Energy project, which addresses how large-scale renewable energy projects can be developed, and a lot of what I've been mentioning on the increased participation and how that participation can be. We have guidelines for different types of actors around that project, and I'm going to share the websites in a bit in the chat, because we share step by step what should be done for the development of renewable energy projects, for them to be inclusive and participatory. We also have other projects. For example, we are trying to develop a solar communal land project. Again, going back to demonstrating that renewable energy can have different forms of ownership. So we're working in Guanajuato to develop a shared ownership project, solar photovoltaic project. There are also other projects like the solar homes project, in which we are working to propose a redistribution of the electricity subsidy to finance distributed generation in homes. And then another project, we're working with developing financial safeguards to promote loans for small and medium enterprises to acquire solar photovoltaic. So within these different projects, we can see that there are ways of pushing for a more inclusive and just energy transition for small companies, for homes, for large renewable energy projects, and of course, to transition away from fossil fuels. And I'm going to leave it at that. I think I've spoken for too long. I'm sorry, Florian.
No, thank you, Anna. It's very interesting and sometimes take time to develop. As I think Mauro has experience with. So Mauro, if you want to go ahead and tell us a little bit more about solutions that that the town or you or whoever has come up with in Argentina for just transition, I am eager to hear it.
Great, thank you, Florian. Well, great presentations from Jesse and Anna. I think they were great to try to understand a little bit further the complexities in different places and sometimes the similarities as well. I will share again my screen. I have like twice just to reflect, and maybe these things bring some comments or reactions or questions from the audience. Here you can see it okay, right? Florian? Yes. Okay, good. So reflecting from what we were talking a little bit before, here what we see below the word challenges is a statue of two miners that it's next to the entrance to Rio Turbio. There's another town called 28th of November, and they have many statues of miners like with this attitude, you know, that's the identity. And this is where I'm going back to try to reflect on what does it mean, because sometimes we talk about them and their identity and what happens to us. Sometimes I would like to reflect a little bit on that, right? If we are out of the climate issue and someone come and say, well, you should do something else because this is dumb. What happens? What happens if you put, you imagine Mick Jagger selling clothes? Is it possible? Is it so easy to imagine? And these stupid examples sometimes, for me, are interesting to try to understand the cost, the human cost that those transitions are requiring for them. It's not just saying like, well, we need to press a button. It requires a tremendous human effort to try to re-signify your own living when you have been living for quite some time, or sometimes your whole life, and even your ancestors, with a specific identity, in this case, very strong as this image shows, linked to community, linked to the strength and all that. So one of the key challenges in that sense, and this helps us to think further, is this single asset town ideas, right? The build up of single asset towns that are still happening, like in Argentina. As you said in the introduction, Florian, fracking, for example, is the new big thing. The promise of the Argentinian reconstruction is based in Vaca Muerta, which is a huge, like the second and fourth largest unconventional gas and oil reserves in the world. And we're planning our future, again, with a lot of commitments made at the UNFCCC and other fora, but our domestic economic policies are heading towards more hydrocarbons, fossil fuels. And again, For example, in a town called Añelo, in the heart of Vaca Muerta, they're building the town as a single asset town, where before it used to be a town that has pears, apples, like different plantations, different alternatives, and now it's everything. It's oil and rising prices for properties. For example, all what you can see when fossil fuels go into these kind of towns, and they transform it into something unique in the sense of that it doesn't have alternatives or diversity. It's like a tsunami that goes through the diversity that those places had before. And I think that's one of the key challenges to see what is coming next, how to avoid that. And I think Anna said a little bit about this before me, about these different kind of localized renewable energies with the participation of communities. I think that's key. And another challenge that is very crucial in the case of Rio Turbio in particular, because again, let me reflect on this. I think that the work that FARN has moved forward that I've been researching, but it's interesting because it looks at people. It's not. It's looking at people that could be everywhere. Of course, it's in Argentinian context. This is why I put it in context. But it could be exported if you not the same idea, but the feelings and the transitions. Sometimes you can understand that can happen in some other places as well. In Argentina, particularly, and this point, the second point goes to a particular case. The province of Santa Cruz is the home province of the government that has been ruling for 12 years before a mandate of a neoliberal government by Mauricio Macri, and now is back in power. So it's very strong, a very strong Peronist government, and with strong links with the unions. And this is another challenge that we see, that the political nuances and the verticalism of unions, particularly in that province and particularly in Rio Turbio, very challenging to start thinking about something else. At the same time, there is another possibility, that is that change is political. If the political hierarchy changes, potentially the unions will follow. So that could be a window of opportunity, but we need a lot of hope to see that happening, and we need a lot of pressure on the government to actually make that happen as well. Again, what I was saying before, long-term promises and low share of responsibility. This is key, because this is something that workers very knowingly demand to the global north. It's like, we don't need this, we don't need to transition, they need to transition. We can do that later. I talked to the mayor of the town and he said, okay, we can discuss a transition for 20 or 30 years. Not now. This plant needs to be built. This plant needs to burn the coal that is extracted from the mine. They are acknowledging that there is a potential transition in 20 or 30 years. So again, let me be helpful. It's a matter of the pace, it's a matter of the caring approach, it's a matter of political will, but you see that these things are starting to be transformed. And again, I'm in the challenges part. I'm not trying to see opportunities yet, but I think that these challenges bring some potential hope for what is coming next. Again, the identity part, I will not go into that again. I think that's I talked about that with the picture itself, and I think that is key. But again, to have a state-owned company, as I said before, with the nuances and the verticalism with unions, could be an opportunity. Of course, it is now a challenge, but it could be an opportunity. Then another challenge is the parallel transitions that are going on. Again, it could be transformed into an opportunity, but many factors need to transition. And what I've seen there, like before, I come from 12 years working in climate and energy issues at Greenpeace. I was with the energy head. When I get there, it's like press the button off, shift the way of production or the fuel to gas, and that's it. And for them, all what they are is extraction of coal, and the future that they wanted was that coal power plant. So when you go there and you talk to them, you can see these different approaches, like the verticalism approach, the patriarchal order, and the concept of success that sometimes is linked to buying a bigger SUV. So there are many things. I think we all are going through, and we all need to deconstruct at the same time, particularly in these towns that are so close and where the expectation of the youth is to go into the company and to work in the company and to become the strong miner that their father was. It's something that is starting to transition, and this is why, again, and I will shift to the opportunities now, but I think that the feminism came to kind of break a little bit and to shake those ideas, particularly in Argentina. And again, I was expecting to see none of that in a coal mining town, and it was not like that. It was there, and it is happening. The picture here is of one female worker, Vanessa, who is working not in the mine itself. Women are forbidden in the mines because of superstition, and they cannot work in the mine, but she works in a water plant next to it. And she said, I will just share this phrase from my interview with her. She has 4 male children, and she said, I don't want them to be miners. I want them to study and to go out of Rio. So these things are starting to happen. So again, intersectional struggles, the underlying struggles are increasing the awareness against not only extractivism itself, but as forms of domination. Some of the miners said, we are against mega mining. We are against huge mining. We do this specific mining techniques that are less harmful. And then you talk about coal, and again, this is where common differentiated responsibilities appear. But anyway, they're aware of the impact, and they are starting to see what sometimes when this is not your source of work, you try to understand how this is already a form of domination. So in that sense, again, you need to look at specific, that's at least one of the learnings that I got from it, the localized just transition plans that are empathetic, particularly to specific social context with their particular challenges. There is no one size fits all. It's not like, even if you can identify the experiences of the workers in Rio Turbio, it will not be the same as in Pumalanga or in other places. So it needs to be, it needs to consider the people living there and not only the workers. This is why a present state is very important, and they acknowledge that. Particularly in the case of Rio Turbio, I will say again, because the state is the one that is extracting the coal, is the owner, and it's historically been there doing that. But that present state doesn't need to be like the strong hand of the state saying we're done with this and we will move to something else. It needs to accompany, it needs to be a caring state that accompany workers and families and the community as a whole, because again, there is someone selling food or selling other things that require people to move to the town, and if someone goes as a tourist, it will mainly be because they're linked to the coal mine in one or another way. So it's the whole community. And lastly, one opportunity that I think that it's interesting is how the decolonizing and the industrializing views were there. They were already there, but what we need to shift is the angle of production. It's not coal production, and that's of course the most difficult. But decolonizing and industrializing in a different way that breaks the bonds of extractive domination, and again the vicious circle of debt and extractivism is there, and they will be fighters for that struggle. But again, the transition away of their identities, of course, is a huge challenge that needs to be done with care and with a caring presence. So my question, just again to spark like a last conversation or debate, is what transitions are we talking about? And in the left of your screens, you will see one traditional miner that went to the National Congress to protest for his rights for the payment of the salaries that he was not getting. And he's a worker. He's not the enemy of the climate movement. He's working for and he's struggling for his rights. That's the identity that the miner always had. And in the right, you have Carla, one only trans miner that I've met, and she's working in the mine. She's the only woman, and this is why I said before, women are not allowed in the mine. And she got, as she said to me, to hack the system. And she's working since 10 years within the mine. And that was something that shakes everything within the company, within her colleagues. And when we were discussing, she said, of course, I want coal to continue. This is my source of work. But I understand what transitions mean. I understand how hard and difficult these transitions are. So I don't want to, she's not the face of the transition away from coal. She's the face of her own study, of her own history. But I think that these underlying transitions are already happening. They are already there. And what we need to do is to connect some of those struggles and to try to again, and I think Jesse said about this in particular, the particular case of South Africa, how the youth and women are the most affected in many cases, and sometimes they can be ones that are the leaders of the transitions that we need. Claudia, thank you very much, and thanks to FARN and to all the rest of the team for inviting us and for letting me be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Mauro, for these very inspiring words. And I mean, even if women in artisanal coal mining may not be the change we want for a complete energy transition, it does change perceptions, and I think that is the very important part. Ambassador Blacklane, we have heard a lot of challenges and solutions within this last hour. Is there anything to take away for a country like Antigua and Barbuda, or are the challenges so different that every country has to go their own way?
Well, I mean, it was really interesting listening to the other examples and the challenges that they have. Thankfully, in Antigua, we're really small. So I see in South Africa, I guess, I mean, of course, you have to make sure with that high level of employment is a priority. But it would be really sad, at least for me looking at that situation, for persons to be employed in a situation where the air quality is really bad. So, I mean, there's a lot of struggles there. So I wish all of those countries, the bigger countries, the issue, and of course we can relate to the miners in Argentina and how they relate to their jobs, which is similar to what we have in that situation, is similar to what we have in Antigua, where we have these sectors that are male, consist of 90% male, and it has been traditionally really hard to transition male-dominated sectors. I mean, in the past, when you look back in the past of transitioning male-dominated sectors, I mean, that's been done through wars. So it hasn't been easier. And in the United States, you could see that the fossil fuel industry and the coal industry lobby and the previous president, and most of the people who are voting for him are uneducated men. So clearly there is, you have to have a recognition that the people that you're transitioning, I agree, that you have to be, you have to understand where they're coming from, how they think about and how they relate to their current position, and then to create an opportunity for them to transition with dignity, not only just dignity, with hopefully with hope and anticipation, you know, that I can do something different. So in Antigua and Barbuda, we were slavery, and then we had to go to agriculture. We had the usual traditional cane industry, and then we had to transition to tourism. And then we had to transition from a monopoly of cable and wireless from the UK, monopolizing our communication system. And when we were transitioning from that, if you hear the stories, the world is going to come caving in and all of these issues. And we heard it all. We could have repeated this seminar now back 30 years ago, and we transitioned. And that transition that we took place in our small island took place in less than a generation. One generation, 3 different sets of transition that occurred. So I guess for the capacity of an island like ours, we had no choice, because I think for Argentina, maybe others, they're not experiencing hurricanes, they're not experiencing a lot of the things that we had. So we were forced to change on a regular basis and to adapt and become really resilient. So we in Antigua, we are fully prepared to lose our home. So if you're attached to your house and you're thinking that house is going to be 100 years old or the church is going to be 100 years, that's mad. This is not the place for you. So there is a different mindset that we have here. And we have transitioned before in my lifetime and in hopefully my kids' lifetime. So we have that a little bit of an advantage on there. So that's why I'm saying that we still have a lot more work to do to really study how to transition the men in a way that we can transition. The important thing is we have to transition quickly. The longer we stay in the transition phase, the more difficult it becomes. So what we're doing now, actually similar to what Anna was saying in Mexico, is that we have actually created a fund. And that fund is providing concessional financing to regular ordinary people to buy their own distributive solar system with batteries. We need batteries because the hurricanes come and we need generators and stuff like that. So that system that we're working on, I see Anna smiling when she was talking about it, and I'll smile when I'm talking about it too, because it's not supported at all by the utility, who is still very powerful. And so but to get the government to agree to it, we did a study on how much money women are spending on electricity, on their income, their family income, and electricity, and on paying for climate change. And it was really revealing. So we were able to present that to our cabinet to say, listen, women need a cheaper form of energy. The utility is not providing that. And you have to understand, when I'm in cabinet speaking to these things, I'm the only woman talking about it. So on one side, it's just me and female, and on the other side is utility, and they're all males. And they're not even sensitive to that fact. So they don't even the prime minister and everybody's becoming more gender sensitive. They still bring all males. You know, I said, if you brought 2 females in your group, maybe they will listen to you a little bit more, but even if it doesn't mean anything to you. But so we're slowly, like, gently winning, like making inroads into the whole idea. And but there's a lot of misinformation out there. So I'm seeing misinformation also spreading everywhere. So with the misinformation, so we tackle misinformation head on, and we try to simplify the message as simply as possible. So for example, my entire home is solar panel with batteries. So if I'm speaking to a family about it, say, I can tell you all the pitfalls, what I did. And so, you know, they buy into it, and we promise them if something breaks, they will fix it. And so slowly we're seeing this coming to your own understanding. That's important. They're coming to their own understanding. So in our Ndc target, we're looking at targeting 30,000 homes for a renewable energy system, for distributed systems. And the government has said, the Ministry of Finance and Utility, you know, they said, we're not in support of it, but the Prime Minister signed it. We got some funding from the ADFD phase 2 project, and they're putting aside $2 million of that is a loan to purchase renewable energy kits, because we live on an island, shipping things here is expensive. So we pay 3 times as much for renewable energy than anybody else, and they're buying it in bulk. The government is not in agreement with it, but when I take it for them to sign, they sign it. That's because the women in Antigua and the people in Antigua want to have this. So the government is hoping that I'll just go away and not bring them. There's something that, so political risk goes both ways. So I know that they're being pushed by the monopoly, the private monopoly. And so I got the people on my side, and I got them. So when they bring in their renewable energy system, they have to literally go to the minister to get it signed and waive all the taxes. So I don't go myself, and my team don't go. I said, please just go to the minister and let him sign that. He could not say no. So that is the game. You have to understand the game and how to make that transition. And it's not as simple as that. We are a small country, so I've used our smallness to our advantage, but this is what we're doing. With respect to the actual just transition, we are working with, we're applying for money for entrepreneurs so that they can develop their businesses in both electric vehicles and in providing renewable energy. And we plan the transition over 10 to next 15 years. So we're seeing, we will have an actual plan to work with all of the people working with the various entities. We're also working with our oil and gas company. It's just one, very small country, and they too are transitioning. So they just took some shares to the public and they included into the shares that they are transitioning. So we signed an MOU with them, and so they are becoming our asset managers. So so the Department of Environment, let me step back, will become one of the largest owners of renewable energy systems in the country because nobody else wants to stick their neck out. So I'm a woman, I don't understand this male bonding thing, so I'm not as intimidated by it that other people are. So we are installing wind turbines, we're installing solar panels, we're ordering more and more, and the oil company is saying, we will manage them for you. And they're very excited about it. Their staff is excited about it. And they also will be installing 10 megawatts of renewable energy to charge electric vehicles as we're doing the transition. So what we had to little by little, sometimes we want to win the whole fight and see an NDC. So to Anna in Mexico, I think when you change the government, you'll see they can go back and update the NDC, but little by little, you will see changes being made because it's just financially not possible. I mean, renewable is just so much cheaper. And so you would have to see that growth over the rest of the world, and that I think would actually happen. What we don't want to have happen, what those kind of government and that thinking would happen is that the community will get left behind because the world is marching ahead, and then they will get left, and that is a risk to them. So we are just right now with a coalition of the willing. We still have a little bit of time to get it together. And that's basically what we're working on now. I think if we can get a threshold of about 15% of the people using renewable energy, and then they go to church and they talk about it, and they go to their friends and talk about it, I think there's just going to be a quiet revolution without the politicians having to stick their neck out or anybody else having to stick their neck out. And one is a nice, actually, most of the young men love the renewable energy. And it's really interesting because if compared to managing a diesel engine, I mean, the job is so much easier. You just wipe the turbine, you wipe down the solar panel, you just make sure the turbine is oiled, and you get the full salary, and they have you the rest of the day. So the actual work itself is just not as onerous, and you still get a very good salary. So that is, of course, young people that's very appealing to them. And we're also working with our farmers who are very excited. So the male farmers are very excited. They're happy to have solar panels on their farms, and then the animals eating below. Once again, because it's consistent with the farming practices and the farming culture. You go into the farm, you work hard during planting season, you just work a little bit, and then you're hard during the reaping season. And so renewable energy is is aligned with that type of culture. And so that is also really helpful. And finally, we are actually working in the sporting sector. So our only stadium, our cricket and our soccer stadium, will be 100% renewable energy by next summer. And we started to transition the sporting facilities of around the island. So we're putting a wind turbine on the southern part of the island, and that is being installed by the young men in the community, and they're very excited about it. At the level of AOSIS, the Prime Minister is writing to FIFA, because FIFA provides a lot of resources at the national level to many countries, to ask them to step up the finances that they're providing to help them also to transition their use of electricity in the various sporting arena. So we're looking forward to hear what they have to say about that. So we're having a lot of different angles to sort of soften the mental stress of, we believe in Antigua, and I'm sure it's the same in many countries, you have to touch it, feel it, see it work, and then they transition. And so that is what we basically have been doing with some success. Yeah. But we have to transition the men gently, carefully.
Please do it gently.
Yeah.
You mentioned what's it called, opposition by the utility, and actually that was also a question that came up for Jesse for the South African case, because Jesse, maybe you can tell us a little bit about what actually the motivation for Eskom was to move ahead with just transition, because I think that is something that is extremely important for everybody. I think many people here have already mentioned the problem of interconnectedness of challenges and opportunities, and that is also something that would interest me very much. Where do you start? That goes to everybody, but since Jesse is already on the starting line, maybe you can go ahead.
Sure. Thanks, and thanks, I think, Angelina, for the question. So there's a lot of history around Eskom. In 2001, they were voted the best utility in the world, and I know if you know anything about South Africa, you'd find that amazing. And for many years, up until just a few years ago, they were probably one of the biggest blocks to climate action in South Africa. Them and a few big corporate emitters and coal had the whole thing stitched up, you know, and they'd invested in these two mega projects called Medupi and Kusile, 9 gigawatts of coal. And there were huge cost and time overruns. And that's part of the big reason we have such a big debt problem now. A lot of corruption, a lot of like kind of very venal corruption, and then a lot of also kind of strategic political use of Eskom to, for example, buy coal from politically connected companies and things like that. And we also didn't have cost reflective tariffs, which often happens with vertically integrated state-owned enterprises. And they didn't maintain a lot of the coal plants. And then one thing that's very different in South Africa and a lot of other developing countries, but not all, is that other than Medupi and Kusile, which have just been built, our fleet is very old. So they'd under-maintained this plant and it was all falling over and they broke. And it's become more and more clear that the economics of coal is, you know, become less and less good. And there've been a kind of series of CEOs. I think we've had 10 in 10 years or something. It's like basically a poison chalice. And new leadership came in, and I think they just took it seriously. And internally within Eskom, I think there's been more and more understanding about the various, you know, kind of how the costs of renewables have changed versus coal, and more understanding about, you know, what will it take to close these coal plants and repurpose them. So it was kind of a combination of new leadership, survival, economics, the closure and age of the projects, and a global context in which people, for the first time ever, I think maybe 18 months ago, started talking about coal retirement mechanisms. You know, so going beyond just saying, okay, coal's not affordable and we can't build new plants, but to actually, you know, actively think about how you close old and like existing plants, because that's, I don't know, $500 billion worth of them, I think, roughly in the world. And I think it was almost a bit like an idea whose time had come. You know, how do you repower and repurpose these assets? And at the same time, in parallel, obviously, just transition has always been percolating, especially amongst, you know, civil society and labor, but it's in the Paris Agreement. And a lot of people have been pushing and working to have a just transition as part of climate policy. South Africa had it in, you know, it's been in our climate policy since 2011. But I think those things kind of came together. But what it showed for me is that you have a lot of utilities like Eskom who are blocks, but if they pivot, you know, you potentially have a lot of really good things in one place. You have a lot of institutional capacity. You have the ability to coordinate and convene and move workers between assets, and you know, it works very well in the power sector. In our mining sector, mining is owned by lots of different people, lots of different companies. Coordinating that kind of worker transition becomes much more complicated. But actually a state-owned enterprise, which has always had a developmental mandate, is quite good at that, if you can get them to be thinking about this in the context of climate ambition as well as social development.
Yeah, we have kind of a similar situation in Germany. While it's well, it's a little bit different because one of our, or actually a few of our largest power producing companies have now split between like future renewable energy companies and more or less bad banks that still have the old ways of producing energy. And I think they expect to be bailed out by the state. So we're coming back to the throwing at the money problem. But Anna,
can I just comment?
Yeah, sure, sure.
So we see, that's been happening in coal mining here. So the major diversified international miners have been selling their assets onto small local companies because they see a whole lot of reputational risk around being associated with coal mining, and they see a whole lot of risk around the economics of it, flipping their assets onto smaller companies. And I think that will start to happen across the world. And so one of the other things that we talk a lot about here, at least civil society do, is saying, divestment maybe is not always the best thing to do with fossil fuel assets. Actually, we have to talk about responsible closure, and that includes socially responsible closure. Yeah. Sorry, go on to Anna.
No, I absolutely agree. And I think that is also a very good transition again to Anna. Because, yeah, do you think that that Mexican fossil producing companies, be it Pemex or whoever else, can be put in a similar situation? Do you think it's more about individuals? We've had that question as well, or is it also institutional and a structural thing?
I believe it's more of an institutional and structural thing when we talk about our big companies, our big national companies, and the electricity company and the oil company. But those institutions are being directed by individuals with political interests. So that's a bit of what I was trying to answer in the chat box, and thanks for the question over there. I think what we have to do in Mexico right now is sort of like create a higher political cost for our elected officials to support fossil fuels. Because like in Mexico, we are a country with like huge acceptance of climate change being something real. Like we do not have those challenges that other countries have, where a large percentage of their population just deny climate change or things like that. Mexicans generally agree that there is climate change, that it's real, that we're facing it, and that people are suffering from it. But then there's not a lot of it hasn't been yet translated into an actual political cost for the leaders that are currently supporting fossil fuels. And right now it's turning into a conversation of whether you support like your country, like a nationalist conversation, versus like, is it the country against private companies? Like that's been the sort of like the dilemma, or that's how they want to portray the dilemma. And what we are trying to push for as civil society is that is not the dilemma. Like you can have renewable energy is not equal to big private companies and big corporations, and supporting a national industry is not necessarily supporting fossil fuels. Like you can be supportive of your own national industry, and that doesn't mean you have to support fossil fuels. So we are trying to create like a narrative for a sort of like a different way. We don't have to go back to how things were being developed previous to this administration, where there were a lot of huge scale renewable energy projects that were not necessarily being responsible with the local communities. We don't want to go back to that, but we do need an energy transition. So we're trying to argue for this sort of like third way in which we can have all of that. And I think the national utilities companies can play a significant role if they incorporate this the ambition and the goals. I mean, they could develop renewable energies. Of course, then there's the financing challenge, because these companies do not have the resources, and it's a whole other debate. I'm gonna leave it at that.
Thank you. Well, we're almost out of time, but I have one last question from the chat, which I would like to like all panelists to answer in one sentence, kind of as a as an ending thing, because I think that's very, very relevant. It was asked that what can we actually do? So what can an individual do in relevant actions as the next generation to participate in this transition process based on your experience? So Ambassador Blacklane, please go ahead. One sentence, what can we do?
You can invest in your own, start with your own energy system at home and then go from there. So become an investor. Demand the opportunity, demand your right to become an investor in your own energy system.
Great. Mauro, what can we do?
Difficult, but good question. I think that the demand, the action that is needed to the leadership, to political leadership, it's absolutely key, but at the same time done without just the banner, but also with awareness that there are people that can suffer from only banners, and do that in that again, that caring way, and promoting those changes, including like with people within, and not changes with people outside.
Thank you. Anna, what can we do?
I like both of the previous answers, and I think I'm gonna put the third one. So like, we can change our consumption patterns, and this includes like how we consume energy, but also how we consume politics and who we follow. So try to be more conscious of who we are supporting in terms of how we consume and how we vote.
Thanks. I think that's relevant. Jesse, what should we do?
I think if you're a youth, you should definitely join your local climate strikes, but you should also make sure that the local climate strikes are in an alliance with workers and communities. So you're fighting for just transition, not just an energy transition.
Thanks. I think that are perfect ending words. I thank you all very, very much. Also Bob, who has been here and has outlined the problem. Thanks to every one of you, and together I think we can make this happen. So yeah, thanks also to all participants. I see we still have a lot there, so thanks for staying with us until the end. And I hope you found it interesting, and join us if we do this again. So thanks a lot, and yeah, goodbye until the next time.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Florian.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye.